I'm going to start just by sort of giving a bit of a setting, and then we'll sort of go into the panel. And after I've done my setting, I'll ask the panelists just to introduce themselves a little bit more. So the green transition is essential if we're going to tackle climate change, and that means we're going to have to reduce the use of fossil fuels to run engines and to generate heat and power. And to do that, electrification is going to be all important. But if we're going to use electrification, obviously, for things like EVs and mobility, we need a way to store that electricity so it can actually be used in a vehicle. And obviously, that's going to need either batteries, or we're going to need to generate that electricity in the vehicle via use of something like a fuel cell, and therefore hydrogen. But we'll also need energy as well outside of the mobility. And again, not all applications can use electricity, so we'll need to find forms of green energy so that we can actually heat and use to generate power as well. And therefore, hydrogen is going to be a sort of key part of that. But green hydrogen is expensive, as we've already looked at. So the battery raw materials and other metals are going to be key. So we're looking at lithium, we're looking at cobalt, nickel, manganese, we're looking at graphite, we're looking at iron phosphate, and we also need other base metals as well, minor metals and rare earths. If we're going to start building the infrastructure, if we're going to build the solar panels, and if we're going to build the wind turbines as well. So, plus also all those base metals and everything are also going to have to be generated in a green way as possible. So, all in all, we've got a Herculean task ahead of us. And that's what we're going to be discussing today in the panel, and seeing how this region, how the super region can take a part of that. But first of all, can I ask each of the panelists to introduce yourself? Carol, I think you've already done that. But Johnny, if we could start with you.
Hi, everyone. My name's Johnny Lazar. I'm a principal consultant with CRU in London, and I head up our strategy consulting and advisory division. We've done a lot of work recently on decarbonization strategies and the use of some of the decarbonization levers, including the increased use of scrap, renewables, carbon capture and storage, and increasingly multi-stakeholder collaboration in delivering some of the early successes in energy transition. Thank you.
Patrick?
Yeah, excuse me. Patrick Barnes with Wood Mackenzie, based in London. I lead the metals and mining consulting practice. Wood Mackenzie publishes information about the markets that we're talking about today. And we also have teams that advise banks and companies, and as well as governments, on the development of those assets, competitiveness, and how to share value and establish lasting policy.
Thank you. Richard.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Richard Rothenberg. I'm CEO of Global AI. We're a big data artificial intelligence company that works with state-of-the-art technologies, and we advise hedge funds primarily, as well as governments and multilaterals. We do a number of projects with United Nations. And in the mining space, we have analyzed some of the world's largest data sets across more than 30 languages and more than 100 countries to come up with various analyses of sentiment, and using large language models as well as natural language processing to come up with insights that we'll be discussing today at this talk.
And Peter.
Great, thanks, William. Peter Bryant, based in Southern California. Board chair for Clario. We provide expert advice to the mining and energy industry globally around key issues. Been working with the Kingdom's government for 5 years now. Also, board chair for Development Partner Institute, a non-profit to reimagine mining to help grow social economic prosperity for indigenous communities. And finally, leading a group called the Key Mineral Forum in Washington, D.C., working with the US Senate, key agencies on developing a cohesive strategy for the US government on global minerals development.
Great. Okay. Well, we'll stick with you, Peter. And I'd like to ask all of you, actually, just as a starter, where do you think we are in the energy transition at the moment?
Actually, a great question. I'll try and be brief. I've rephrased it from energy transition to we're actually entering a phase of energy expansion. I think the narrative is changing, certainly in the US. I think one is energy demand is growing in the West and the US. Energy demand, after being flat for 20 years, is growing. The realization is about affordable, reliable, secure energy as clean as possible, and not this singular obsession around emissions reduction. And we still have the billion people that don't have electricity in Africa. So I think we're entering a phase of energy expansion where nuclear is becoming more relevant, natural gas is seeing key, and even in the US we're seeing people realizing coal may still have a life for the next 3-4 years. So I think there's a narrative shift, which I think is good, because I think it is energy expansion that we're about, and we need to go full tilt, solar, wind, EVs, nuclear, everything.
Mm-hmm. So I'm based in New York City, and in the US primarily we see a major shift. Now I think we are open to see a major investment flows. However, we still see major challenges, as we've seen from our analysis of sentiment analysis globally. ESG, in particular human rights issues and other ESG factors, have become major impediments. So we see a major gaps on the investment side, but we see major potential as well from blended finance and new structures of infusion of capital liquidity across both liquid and fixed income markets to fill the gaps.
Yeah, I'd say we've made a lot of progress, but we're clearly behind where we need to be, and we're at risk of slowing down more because we're really starting to confront the additional costs of trying to bring on this new supply in a less globalized world. And so honestly, I think we're really wrestling with how fast we're willing to move at the moment, which is, I guess, a bit concerning.
Yeah, I'd say we're at the stage now where we've identified a number of solutions, and those solutions are in the sort of troubled teenage years when they start going out with one another. You start blending solutions. It's less black and white as to which way you're going to go, but then you're confronted with the fact that they bring a lot of cost and a lot of risk. And so that risk has to be shared, and then the cost has to be shared in a fair way. And I think that's the challenge at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I think if you just look at the facts, 2024 was the first year where we had 1.5 degrees more compared to the pre-industrial level. So we're at the 1.5. The expectation is that this year and next year that will be confirmed. So that means, as Patrick was saying, is that, yeah, we are not on target. But if you look at it positively, a lot of things is happening, right? And me being based in China, I would first say that the Chinese have been able to show that you can scale some of these technologies, right? That you can do this very, very fast, and that the price and the costs are coming down very quickly, right? And that is very encouraging, right? Because when things get in the money, and also my presentation, we need business cases, right? And when the things get in the money, a lot of things can happen. But the reality is that coal is still not at the peak, yeah? So there is work to do.
Okay, so using Johnny's expression, I mean, we're at teenage years and we're falling behind a little bit. So Peter, maybe I can just ask you to start off with, and then others feel free to pitch in if you have anything else to say. What do you think is going well, and what do you think is not going well?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think it reflects what some of the other guys were saying is, obviously, around the world, I mean, the adoption of solar and wind. I mean, in the US, for example, the majority of new power generation was solar and wind last year. So those are kind of the positive things, I think. So I think we're building as fast as we can. I think the problem is, and the big challenge is, we've actually reached the maximum point of putting solar and wind on. And with energy demand increasing everywhere in the world, peak coal just got moved out 3-4 years by the IEA. There's just not enough solar and wind to be built out. Batteries aren't there yet to kind of meet the energy demand that we're talking about. So I think that's the big challenge we face. So I don't know if it's not going well. That's a massive challenge. Get us out of our teenage years, if you like. And I think, and accelerating nuclear as well. So I think anti-nuclear is kind of, we've shifted there as well. So I think there's some big challenges ahead for us, to be honest.
Yeah. I would like to mention just that some of the major challenges I see recently are obviously the geopolitical conflicts we're facing across nations, as well as major ESG narratives that are conflicting across major asset managers like BlackRock and the US government, SEC, versus European Union. So that's a major challenge. But some of the other geostrategic imperatives that I see that are critical are the rise of trends like artificial intelligence and the need for to power major AI data centers have pushed companies like NVIDIA and Meta to push for nuclear and other solutions that are needed today for a national competitiveness standpoint. So there's national security imperatives, and among others that are market-driven, that in combination are pushing for a major, I will say, renaissance of new energies.
Okay. The report highlights, if we sort of move into the report now, highlights the sort of the need for significant increase in investment through partnerships to achieve the development, prosperity, and energy transition, both across the super region. And just for those of you who are unaware of what the definition of that is, the super region being Africa, Western, and Central Asia, including 79 countries, that's geographically sort of spread between Western and Eastern hemispheres, stretching from South Africa up to Kazakhstan, as well as the suppliers and customers of those countries as well. At present, we have a situation where China leads in all things to do with the lithium-ion batteries and solar panels. South Korea and Japan have battery supply chains, and North America and Europe are in the process of building those out to different degrees. Plus, we have South America and Australia also in the supply chain, as well as China and Indonesia and Central Africa also supplying sort of bulk of raw materials. Johnny, maybe I could start with you. I mean, why do you think it's important that the FMF report starts with the need for this great need for partnerships?
Yeah, I think Carol mentioned it earlier that there's a real need to scale up. So again, if we talk about those teenage years, it's the time when you stop thinking just that you can do it, and then you try and scale the solutions and the successes up. And when that happens, the cost is way too big for one stakeholder to bear. And usually, because these industries are a lot more dynamic, they're moving a lot more quickly, there is a need for people to share in the risk as well. Now, there isn't really a deficit of responsibility around the world. Actually, pretty much all the stakeholders, both in the super region and elsewhere, have said they're willing to shoulder the burden, but they want that burden to be evenly and fairly distributed. And I think that's where there's a real discrepancy between different parts of the world at the moment. China's been able to do this because it has been able to essentially create that collaborative effort very quickly, and also almost move ahead with it and believe that it's going to work, whereas we don't have that kind of facility in this super region at the moment. There is capital, but probably not enough. There is not enough appetite for risk yet, but it's developing. What you do have in this region is a real ability to compete on costs. And so that combination of capital availability and the ability to compete on costs really creates those opportunities for collaboration throughout the region.
Right. Okay. So within the region, within the super region, costs you're talking there because of the abundant ability to have a lot of solar plus natural gas as well. But what other sort of aspects can this region really sort of bring to the table?
Well,
that's open to everybody.
Sure. So I'll start, but I think what's interesting is, if you're talking about value chains that are dominated by China, you have to ask the question, well, who can compete with China, at least on an OPEX basis? And this region has competitive advantages that make it a potential competitor to China and also a potential collaborator with Chinese innovative initiatives. On the flip side of that, there is a lot of capital intensity that comes with that, and that's something that needs to be managed carefully because obviously the region has to be a net exporter of material, and so that capital intensity has to be looked at with a view towards target markets that are going to be attractive enough. Back to the business case that you were mentioning.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to add onto that is that I think the super region has a very unique opportunity. So, and I think what the Kingdom is offering in terms of its vision for the super region is if we can collaborate, every country wants to retain more of the value of its endowed resources. That's one. So move away from the extract and ship model, which is the Chinese model, it's the Western model. So, and to do that, we need to do that collaboratively across the region. So a vision could be copper from Zambia comes to Saudi Arabia with a green energy platform where we do more processing, batteries, etc. So key in that is how you share the value around, because a lot of the African countries don't have the necessary infrastructure, energy infrastructure to do a lot of that downstream value capture. And I think Economist had a great article 2 weeks ago where Africa, its per capita economies are declining, which is terrible. So how do we reverse course and and get that level of collaboration, unleash the capital? And I think the key is how you de-risk capital. That's where governments like the Kingdom, the United States need to really play. And then you've got this whole geopolitical, national security game playing out, which is a lot of unknowns, particularly with the new administration. So.
Maybe one thing to add to this is that for the super region will be important to learn from what clearly has worked for the Chinese, right? And as you were saying, like there will be Chinese involvement there, and there is already Chinese involvement. But what has worked very well for China is that they have been operationally de-risking, right? What they have done is in the end, between Chinese companies, looked at like how can we create win-wins? How can, like what is a risk for me? You can reduce that risk because you are a step further in the chain, and together we have like a lower risk. That, of course, like encourages them to go faster, right? So that de-risking needs to work. So the key thing there is the ecosystem, right? Companies are not just like two companies are a partner, but like multiple companies. And then also the whole policy environment, this is all one ecosystem. And that has worked well. For instance, if you look at nickel in Indonesia, right, that is where you see that ecosystem at work. But a lot of it is China. Also EPCs, right, are from China and are building there in these industrial parks. So the philosophy there is very good. What we will need to see is that people learn from this, but that they also find win-wins beyond the Chinese companies. Right? And that we get ecosystems, to your point around collaboration, that we get ecosystems that become less Chinese when the Chinese model is applied, right? Or that become more Chinese when a Western model is applied. I think ecosystem, industrial parks, collaboration, joint focus on infrastructure development, efficiency, that's critical for the super region.
Maybe just one thing to add as well that I think the super region can contribute is there are a lot of governments and a lot of groups in the super region that have more of a clarity of ambition, right? Where there is a clear pathway that they want to take and an ambition to develop capacity to industrialize. I mean, I come from the United States, and when I got into this industry, there are a lot of people that ask me, like, do we still do mining? Like, I didn't know the US still did that, right? And now it's pivoted back a little bit, but there are a lot of governments that are willing to partner with companies and commit to the longer term and see the benefits that this can provide for them if they get it right.
Yeah, I would like to just add that I would say the super region has major key competencies and areas of supply and aspects of the supply chain as well that are important. And even though there are major gaps, I think leadership of Saudi Arabia and investors like sovereign investors like the PIF can play a major role and perhaps collaborate more as I was saying, will create a major opportunity to compete with China and perhaps become, I will argue, the top player globally.
So as a follow-up to that, who is in the region can lead it? I mean, these are huge tasks, and if you need a lot of sort of partnerships and a lot of collaboration, who's best placed to lead that?
Well, I think it has to start in the Gulf, because there's a number of things. I think Patrick talked about the declared ambition and the clarity of purpose there. There's also a huge amount of capital readily available to deploy, and there is the processing cost competitiveness. So you can create cost competitive processing hubs within this region, within the Gulf, to essentially gather around the resources from the rest of the super region. But I think the other thing to mention is you can oversee the amount of trial and failure that's happened in the Chinese collaborative effort. There's been a distribution of scale and value, and for every CATL and BYD, there's been 5, 6 others that have failed at a similar or smaller scale. So that ability to try things at different scales with different levels of integration becomes very important as well. And that's where having different types of markets with different competitive advantages is very important. That's why the super region can do a lot more than just the Gulf by itself.
I think just to add on that, it depends a little bit on the stage of the value chain, right? Because it's rare that there are going to be very many countries that can do all of the full value chain on their own, right? Most of the mining is not going to be happening in the Gulf. Some places there is, in gold and in some other commodities, there's a lot of potential, but there isn't the volume, there isn't the geology, there isn't the real estate for it to make that happen. You look at South Asia, you look at Central Asia, and you look at Africa, there's huge potential and a lot more mineralization there. So some of the leadership really does need to come from those regions as well. It can't be, a single pole.
Yeah, that's why, ministerial roundtables going on right now. Yeah. I think it's key that, the governments collaborate, but I think let's not forget the mining industry. This gets back to, the partnering with the mining companies is vital, and the partnership they have with the mineral countries in Africa, and then how that mix with the Gulf, with processing, works. That's complex, and I don't think we figured that out yet, even though the ambition is great. So that's complex.
And the key there, I think, is what you just said, right? Like, this is driven by the processing, because we need to go from the customer all the way up. And that's what you see. If you see what China, like 10 years ago, the Chinese ownership in nickel, in lithium, in copper, right, was like 1/3. When you look at the mining side, 1/3 of the world. But that has, in 10 years' time, like for copper, it's like now half, right? For lithium, it's like 2/3. And this is not driven by just a philosophy or we want to be miners in the world. This is because we have customers for EV. Because of this, we need metal. Because of this, we go out in the world. And that is the whole value chain, the ecosystem, and so on at play.
So a good sort of follow on from that is, so if the super region can sort of build up a alternative or a parallel supply chain, one of the problems that countries have had in trying to do lithium hydroxide and things like that is the know-how, is the experience, and and will China be willing to share that experience? Talking to some of the existing smelters outside of China, refiners outside of China, they're saying the whole capex and opex of setting up a lithium hydroxide plant is so much more expensive anywhere else than in China. So how can this region get over that?
Well, there's a couple of things that it's got going for it. So the region is geographically and geopolitically in a really good position to access both a global market, but also a global market for raw materials. So it can be a hub for all of that. On the Chinese side, obviously, they're quite selective as to the things they want to export, but their access to some of the markets that they want to target is dependent on them being able to process material, not just in China, but elsewhere, to essentially make sense of the global headwinds that we've got going, right? So I think there's been examples over the last year, for example, the battery manufacturing sector has really suffered, has had a tough year, but battery manufacturing outside of China by Chinese companies has been more profitable than the same companies making batteries in China. And so it's not like China is going to shut up shop, it's just going to be quite selective, but there are opportunities there for it to develop within this region, but also for the region to develop alongside it.
I think this also unpacks the problem of price volatility in the market. Your point about plants, lithium's in the toilet, low price, all the plants that were planned for Australia have been cancelled because of, it's too expensive to build. The counter signal, EV sales are slowing down. And we're entering a period of minerals famine. I mean, IEA says 10 million tonnes short 2035. So we've got this juxtaposition where short-term market signals that say don't build new mines. Yet the long-term outlook is we need to accelerate the transition. We need more minerals. Yet today I'm not incentivized if I'm a big miner to invest in big new mines. So there's this kind of slow, gradual mines. So how that plays out and how governments are willing to underwrite that to a degree is going to be key. And I think Saudi Arabia and the Gulf has a huge cost advantage if they really go for it.
So maybe to your question of what are the Chinese companies going to do, maybe I can go back to the World Economic Forum event, the summer Davos that happens every year in China. And when you listen there to the Chinese CEOs, that are of course very numerous at that event, they were all talking about collaboration, right? So I think that is the answer, in my view, to your question, right? Is there an openness to partner? The business people want to collaborate, right? Because they see the business logic.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I would like to add that I think there's going to be some pressure from the Teslas and NVIDIAs of the world, as well as the asset owners, the emerging sovereign wealth funds, and all the institutional investors that are going to start looking at sustainable mining, as well as suppliers that have similar values, consistent with these major companies. And we see some lack of transparency sometimes in countries like China and others. And ESG as well is suffering there. So I believe that the FMF has an opportunity there to increase collaboration, transparency, and align with the ESG and values and sustainable mining, along with the PIF. And so the Aramco, I think there's a major opportunity.
Richard, staying with you, your work has been on sort of sentiment analysis, and the super region has sort of come out highly in that. Do you want to expand a bit on that and sort of some of the reasons why you think this area, has come up high, whereas somewhere like Europe, where there's a lot of sort of pushback against mining or against operations, a lot of sort of not in my backyard sort of attitude. How do you see this region benefiting?
Yeah, absolutely, precisely. So when we look at sentiment analysis, it's basically we use large-scale algorithms that have the ability to read all the news available across more than 60 languages in more than 150 countries. And we look at blogs, social media, news, NGO reports, etc. And we're able to see the details. And when we look at the details, the FMF suffers on a negative sentiment in areas like cobalt, primarily coming from countries like Zambia, where there's major NGO presence and negative news in regards to how the production is made and human rights abuses. But overall, in other areas, we see a positive trend, except in Europe, where there's bigger presence of NGOs that are more outspoken. But when you compare it to the rest of the world, the FMF comes ahead across all critical minerals, including lithium, especially lithium and copper. And I think if this trend continues, as I was saying earlier, there's a major opportunity to become the major supplier for the companies of the future that are going to be driving demand, like the Teslas and all the new energy companies in the market.
Okay, thank you. Europe, has tried to build its supply chain, and some of it is working, some of it, has run into trouble. And we're seeing a lot of permitting takes a lot of time. The arranging of finance takes a lot of time, especially to Peter's point when prices are low as well. And the process of sort of building refineries is also, run into barriers too. And we've seen sort of CAM and battery factories have either been cancelled or put on hold or are delayed. I mean, what else apart from the sort of the IGO, not the IGO, the NGO aspect? What other aspects do you think have gone wrong in Europe, and what can we learn from that, do you think?
I think one of the things that you tend to see, not just in Europe, but around the world, because it's something that's been developing a value chain and getting more in-country value addition has been a really high priority for nearly every minister and president everywhere for a long time, right? And one reason why it often doesn't work is because people often paint it with too broad a brush, right? They're looking to accomplish a lot of things at once, right? They're not necessarily prioritizing which benefits they want, and as a result, you end up applying. It's almost like if you know that something's unwell and you just start throwing medicines at it, and you don't know what the right dose is, and you don't know what you're really treating. So I think one of the main challenges that Europe has had is it's really, in some cases, really butted its head against competitiveness question. And Earl came to this a little bit earlier as well. A lot of times developing something outside of China or where there isn't a sustainable competitive advantage just costs more. And governments that have forged ahead with policies that increase prices have not had much staying power recently. And so it really takes a significant commitment to develop a value chain if you don't have that sustainable cost advantage.
This is a huge issue. You know, we're entering a period of strategic decoupling from China as a political imperative in Europe and the United States. At the same time, all the capability and know-how for a lot of these efforts is in China. And I just don't believe Europe and the US can get to low-cost downstream processing in the next 10 years, and neither governments have the financial resources to subsidize their way through that. And we've seen with nickel, nobody cares if that's green. You know, we've seen the green premium doesn't exist. So I want the lowest cost anything. So, you know, how do we do this decoupling at the same time as collaboration? I think that's $1 million question. Not sure. You know, in the tech industry, we call it, what is it? Competitive collaboration. One day we're competing. Next day we're collaborating. So I'm not confident that we can get there in the next couple of years, but we'll see. It depends how serious we are.
There's a problem at the moment because obviously macroeconomically, Europe and North America are struggling with high costs across everything, not just industry. And so there's only so many things you can afford to do, and there's a clear lack of focus. When you list 65 critical minerals and you try and do things about every one of those, you're going to do very little about very little.
Yes.
Whereas I think one of the lessons out of China has been identify 2 or 3 segments of industry where you think you might do well and follow through, and good things are going to happen. But at the moment, I think if you look at the critical mineral lists out of the US, Australia, Europe, Japan, they're all 40 minerals plus. And there's very little you can do with no money across 40 minerals.
Yeah, and maybe the other thing to build on what you both were saying is that in the end, you need to build an industry. Right? It's not, we know, from the European example, for instance, not good to just subsidize at the end of an uncompetitive chain. And to say, okay, now as a government, I'm going to put the thing to incentivize that like people use it. No, you want to put your money in building an industry that is competitive. So that is the whole reflection, and I fully agree that like for this, choices need to be made, priorities, where you really want to win. And then you build something for the future rather than fixing it at the end.
And last point, can I add one point?
Yeah.
Just communities, let's not forget communities. So I think we're seeing globally, whether it's Canada, Australia, where communities are going, that might be all very well, but we don't want this here. We see that playing out in Serbia. It's a strategic imperative to build this massive lithium resource. The community's going, no, we don't want tailing dams, we don't want dry tailings. Australia is increasingly an anti-mining jurisdiction communities. Africa communities are going, we want to see the prosperity. And they will stop projects and they drive up costs. So how we address communities amongst this is, I think, lost. And I think Serbia is a great example in the West. I mean, very hard to permit and approve a mine in the US. I mean, resolution is caught up with indigenous issues. So I think, so we've got this, again, kind of irony of this is urgent, but we just can't get anything done because there's all these issues swirling around. So
Yeah, just finally to sort of, you know, I understand everything you've been saying. I mean, if you've got the European EV manufacturers, for example, ploughing billions of euros into their manufacturing lines, you know, they need a localized supply. So is it, going to your point, Peter, is it a case of governments having to change attitude of the communities that, you know, we do need to mine today or process today so we can then get into a circular economy, which is what we're sort of ultimately going.
I think so, yeah, and I think mining, and we've got an innovation panel coming up, mining has to change. Mining, the way it's done today, is unsustainable. It's too energy, water, and waste intensive for a lot of the minerals, and I think, you know, it's different per mineral, obviously, but we can't keep mining the way we are. So.
And the thing is, you need to go from the mining all the way to the end customer. You need to build the end-to-end value chain, because also, for instance, in Africa, like the opportunity, like if you take the copper belt needs clear availability of power. The power needs, of course, infrastructure. That infrastructure is good also for the country, but it needs to be balanced. And then I don't want to just have infrastructure for maybe a community and for the mining, but what about the processing? What about then further value added and more value added jobs also? So I think that's where, if we have a very small solution space, right, we will not come up with like sustainable solutions. If we build a bigger solution space, then I think we can really create something very different.
But it has to be focused, because if you look at what Europe has been successful at, it's created a mostly renewable-based grid in a very short period of time, very successfully, with a bunch of very profitable utility companies, right? So if that can happen, other things can happen too, but the fit has to be there, and then the focus has to be there, and as you say, you have to build the whole industrial segment. You don't get to half backside it.
Brilliant. And on that, yes, sorry.
No, I'd like to add that we should not underestimate the investment side, because sometimes there's clarity on solutions and what should be done, but sometimes there's massive actually gaps, multi-trillion gaps in terms of what needs to be financed and how. And I believe that government is not enough, subsidies is not enough. Even multilateral World Bank is a tiny fraction of what's needed. We truly need private sector participation and innovative financing mechanism beyond green bonds, like SDG bonds and other that are coming up, and as well as political willingness to support these risks, these opportunities.
Great. Well, on that, I'd like to thank you all very much. Very interesting conversation. Please thank our panel.